Okay, good morning, everyone. Today's passage is Nehemiah 9:22 to 38, and it's jumping in the middle of something. So I'll just start by explaining what's going on. So Nehemiah, a servant of the Persian king, has been allowed to return to Jerusalem to supervise the rebuilding of its walls. He's achieved that, and then he brought all the people together, and the law of Moses was read out loud. And then the people celebrated. And they celebrated for 24 days. And after that, they confessed their sins and those of their ancestors, which involved fasting, sprinkling dust on their heads, and wearing sackcloth. And as part of this, they have gone through their history from Abraham, starting at Abraham, looking back at what has God done for them. So we've had Moses leading his people out of Egypt, giving the law on Mount Sinai, and now they've reached the promised land. So that's where we're picking it up. And it goes like this. You gave them kingdoms and nations, allotting to them even the remotest frontiers. They took over the country of Sihon, king of Heshbon, and the country of Og, king of Bashan. You made their children as numerous as the stars in the sky, and you brought them to the land that you told their parents to enter and possess. Their children went in and took possession of the land. You subdued before them the Canaanites who lived in the land, and you gave the Canaanites into their hand, along with their kings and the peoples of the land, to deal with them as they pleased. They captured fortified cities and fertile land. They took possession of houses filled with all kinds of good things, wells already dug, vineyards, olive groves, and fruit trees in abundance. They ate to the full and were well nourished. They reveled in your great goodness. But they were disobedient and rebelled against you. They turned their backs on your law. They killed your prophets, who had warned them in order to turn them back to you. They committed awful blasphemies. So you delivered them to the hands of their enemies, who oppressed them. But when they were oppressed, they cried out to you. From heaven you heard them, and in your great compassion you gave them deliverance, who rescued them from the hand of their enemies. But as soon as they were at rest, they again did what was evil in your sight. Then you abandoned them to the hand of their enemies, so that they ruled over them. And they cried out to you again, and you heard from heaven, and in your compassion you delivered them time after time. You warned them in order to turn back to your law, but they became arrogant and disobeyed your commands. They sinned against your ordinances, of which you said, the person who obeys them will live by them. Stubbornly, they turned their backs on you, became stiff-necked, and refused to listen. For many years you were patient with them. By your Spirit you warned them through your prophets, yet they paid no attention. So you gave them into the hands of the neighboring peoples. But in your great mercy you did not put an end to them or abandon them, for you are a gracious and a merciful God. Now, therefore, our God, the great God, mighty and awesome, who keeps his covenant of love, do not let all this hardship seem trifling in your eyes, the hardship that has come upon us, on our kings and leaders, on our priests and prophets, on our ancestors and all your people, from the days of the kings of Assyria until today. In all that has happened to us, you have remained righteous. You have acted faithfully, while we acted wickedly. Our kings, our leaders, our priests, and our ancestors did not follow your law. They did not pay attention to your commands or the statutes you warned them to keep, even while they were in their kingdom, enjoying your great goodness to them in the spacious and fertile lands you gave them. They did not serve you or turn away from their evil ways. But see, we are slaves today, slaves in the land that you gave our ancestors so they could eat its fruit and other good things it produces. Because of our sins, its abundant harvest goes to the kings you have placed over us. They rule over our bodies and our cattle as they please. We are in great distress. So what we have here is a very succinct statement, even though that was quite long, of how at least the priestly caste of ancient Judah, who wrote much of the Old Testament, viewed the world. And this worldview comes up time and time again in the history books of the Old Testament. And basically, the way they see things is God has made a covenant with them, and it's a bargain. God has given them a promised land, but they must live by God's laws, and then everything will be okay. And if they rebel, things go wrong. So they look back at their history and they look at where things go wrong, and they attribute it as a failure as a nation as a whole to follow God's laws. And as a result of that failure to follow God's laws, they get invaded by foreign powers. And they think, and they recognize, when the country recognizes its failures and cries out to God, he rescues them, and things go right again and again and again. And central to this worldview is that God can do no wrong. He's never unfaithful. He never lets them down. If things go wrong, it's because they've done something bad. And at this point, they're still ruled by another power. They don't have independence as a nation, and it's making them sad. And they see their political situation as a direct result of the failure of their ancestors, so not themselves, to follow the law. So that's the way an ancient Jew looks at the world. And I suppose the question is, does it apply to us? When things go bad for us as a nation, is it because we have failed to follow God's law? And I think as a nation, we are in a very different position from the ancient Jews, because to the best of my knowledge, God has not made a covenant with the United Kingdom, unless there is something that Boris is not telling us. As far as I'm aware, God has never met with us as a nation and promised us success if we follow his commands. We've got a new covenant, and it's a covenant with God's people, the church, rather than a particular nation. And it's not based on a bargain where we follow the rules and it goes well for us. It's a covenant based on Jesus' blood, where we fail to follow the rules and he forgives us. I'm not sure how Jews today understand their covenant with God, how their covenant with God works. I'd like to know. The idea that success as a nation is linked to faithfulness to the law must have taken a terrible battering in AD 63, when the Jewish revolt failed, the Romans captured Jerusalem, and Herod's temple, the temple described in the New Testament, was completely destroyed. And then they've had 2,000 years of being persecuted, ending in the Holocaust. And it must call into question this worldview that bad things happen when you don't follow the law properly. But does it apply to us personally? If we follow God's ways, will things go well for us? And if we don't, will he punish us with disasters? Well, I don't think so either. That doesn't seem to be the message of Jesus. Quite the opposite, in fact. When some teachers of the law ask Jesus why a man is blind, they say, is it because of his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus says, well, neither. It's so the power of God can be seen. And he goes and heals the man. And if you look around you, often you see that the naughty people prosper. Well, good Christian people are hit by wave and wave of misfortune. So I don't think we can sort of equate success and things going right with us following God's way. But I think this passage shows the ancient Jews understood a couple of really, really important things. The first is, when bad things happen, it's not God's fault. He is the good and the righteous one. He's not actively planning us harm. And second, that sin is serious. And while I don't think it's helpful to equate bad things happening in our lives as punishment from God for the past sins of our actions, for our past sins, our actions have consequences. One way of thinking about sin is it involves deviating from God's pattern of living well. And he's set that pattern because it's good for us and it's good for our community. So pretty obviously, if we start doing things that are bad for you and bad for your community, whether it's having an affair, leaving litter, or overuse of the earth's resources, inevitably it's going to have unpleasant consequences, either for you or for someone else. Unfortunately, sin is inevitable, but we can work on reducing it and avoiding it when it happens. And when it happens, we need to confess it and deal with it by stopping doing it anymore and taking the steps we can to heal the hurt. So I think the ancient Jews were doing a good thing here by confessing their sins and being aware of them so they could change. And confession and reflection on our sins has always been a part of the church's pattern of worship for most of its life. And it's an important part of the beginning of many church services. It doesn't play much of a part in our corporate worship for us at Christ Central. And I think we probably are missing something important there. I think the other thing about sin is we keep on finding new sins because life keeps changing and getting more complicated. Like an example of this is in the 19th century, no one thought that burning large amounts of coal could be a sin. It took them a little while to work out that paying a child a pittance to get the coal out of a mine probably was a sin. And cheap power provided by that coal made the world an immeasurably better place. But now the population has grown vastly, everyone wants the cheap power, and suddenly using coal to get that power turns out to have terrible consequences. So what was once a whiz-a-wheeze now doesn't seem quite such a clever idea. So maybe it's best not to see sin as a set of fixed rules given by God once and for all at a certain point in time, rather than look at it as an healthy way of being, the opposite of the way of life that loves and respects our Creator and our neighbours. And sometimes, because we can't see everything, we don't understand everything, it becomes apparent that something, once we thought was okay, isn't okay anymore. And that's all I have for you.